Daly and the deputies 20 minutes.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I certainly won't use that amount, I hope. But I do think that it is a hugely important issue, obviously. We have many citizens whose livelihoods depend on the taxi industry, a lot of people employed in it, and a lot of people who, to be honest, are in an incredibly precarious economic situation in attempting to earn their livelihoods from an industry that is under pressure. And I don't want to repeat all of the points that have been made in the debate so far, but I do think some of them need to be emphasised. And I think clearly the fact that many of the full-time taxi organisations and their representative groups in particular being concerned about the fact that maybe they weren't sufficiently adequately consulted in drawing up this bill, and I think that is something that we have to take into account. The point has been made, and I agree with it, that there is probably an exaggerated focus on regulation in terms of criminal behaviour in the industry and the emphasis on a clean-up of an industry, which I think is a bit unfair, to be honest, on hard-working, honest taxi drivers who are working severely long hours in the industry. Now, clearly nobody would object to an emphasis on public safety and cleaning up any area of society, but I do think we have to be measured and pinpoint the fact that criminal activity in the industry is actually relatively low, and we can have procedures for vetting and so on, but the procedure is one thing. How that procedure is implemented is another thing, and I think it is interesting that we had the focus from the Garda Ombudsman last week into the Kieran Boylan situation, where in that instance the Department of Transport had sought information from the Gardaí with regards to this individual applying for a haulage licence, and was told by the Gardaí, yeah, grand, no problem, this person doesn't have any convictions whatsoever. Now we're talking about, which clearly obviously was completely and utterly false, and he was given the licence. So now we're talking about procedures for the vetting of taxi drivers and so on, but we need to be confident that the Gardaí who are furnishing a lot of that information are sure they're facts, and that there is a transparent procedure there for overseeing that, because I am aware of some people who've maybe not had any criminal conviction, but who've had maybe a few difficulties with members of Garda Síochána who found it difficult to get a taxi licence because of objections made without actually a sufficiently solid basis being made in that regard. So I do think, while on the one hand it's important to absolutely deal with the issue of criminal behaviour, at the same time we have to have a balanced approach with regard to the state of the industry at the moment and where it's going. And I think in that sense the key issue facing the industry is not in fact criminality, but really is the problem for full-time drivers who are struggling to make a living in an oversupplied market against the backdrop of a very unfavourable economic climate. And in that sense, I have to say I don't think that the bill does go far enough in terms of regulating the industry, and in fact that it's probably legitimate of a lot of the groups who are complaining that a number of their submissions were ignored and weren't taken on board sufficiently. Now, look, I mean, the biggest concern the taxi drivers have, in some ways the same as everyone else, is how do you make ends meet against this backdrop of austerity. But it is the case for taxi drivers, it is that bit harder because of the oversupply in the industry, because of deregulation and the serious problems that that has caused for full-time drivers. Now, you know, the statistics have been given already about, you know, the figures. Dublin having more taxis per head than New York, 11,000 taxis in Dublin and so on in 2010, which was absolutely ludicrous and clearly would substantially undermine and compromise a taxi driver's ability to make a living. And look, we've all had the stories which have been truly heartbreaking of people trying to make ends meet, people getting up in the middle of the night, leaving their spouse in bed to go out and drive around the streets to maybe pick up one fare, hardly even cover the price of petrol. We had a call to the office there a while ago from a man who said he had one fare in an 8-hour shift that it cost him more to go to work than the pittance that he earned on that one fare, and after spending 8 hours away from his family, that he really felt like nearly ending it all, that he was struggling so much to make ends meet. And I'm not overplaying that point, but it has been well documented by the Samaritans and others about the incidence of suicide in the taxi industry and how difficult people have found it to make ends meet. And the biggest culprit in that really has been deregulation, but also, to be honest, the increased costs of fuel, the increased costs of NCT tests, other compliance tests and so on, against the backdrop, obviously, of a difficult economic situation. And I do think that we need to take cognizance of that. I mean, if you like, taxi drivers nearly have it worse than anybody else in a lot of ways. You know, people say they say that, but it is actually quite true in many instances. If you take the new home tax, taxi drivers find themselves in the category where they are reliant on a tax compliance cert and find it very difficult. They won't be able to work unless they furnish evidence that they've paid the home tax, which again is a double whammy when they're not making enough money to make a livelihood anyway. And I think that is something that maybe the bill doesn't give enough attention to, is that overall background situation and pressure that's on. But just a couple of brief points really that I wanted to focus on is, the bill, in attempting to reintroduce some form of regulation, has caused some problems which I think have been highlighted already, but do need to be addressed under the various headings of the ban on the transfer of licences, the age limit for vehicles, and the proposed introduction of the penalty points system, all of which I think need to be looked at as the bill goes forward. Now, I think the taxi licence itself and the changes in that regard, clearly the taxi licence was an asset for drivers. It's going to be devalued. They can't pass it on, for example, to a family member, and that is something that has been argued is a discriminatory measure. And you have to look at it that it actually is, in the sense of when other licence holders, publicans and so on, aren't prohibited from transferring on licences, but can actually sell it on as part of their property. In this instance, that can't be done, and I don't think that gives rise to an even playing field. I think the issue as well of the fact that the taxi licence is for the vehicle and not the driver. So in that context, the answer that you've given previously, Minister, that this is being introduced to ensure suitability of the driver, isn't really correct. That's an issue that relates to the PSV licence that determines driver suitability, but this is in terms of the vehicle, and in this sense, this bill gives you the power to possibly implement and issue another set of licences that we have no say over or no check over what that might be. But I do think that maybe one of the issues which has got a good airing in the debate, and I think justifiably so, is the whole issue of taxis that have been adapted to wheelchair accessible taxis and the whole area of disability. And the reason why this is very much centre stage is a couple of reasons. Obviously, those experiencing disabilities have had a huge number of blows with the issue with the mobility allowance. In the last 2 weeks, we've had the European Court of Justice ruling that Ireland's subsidy and refund of excise duty to disabled drivers for fuel is potentially unlawful, which again is another potential undermining of disabled drivers. And I mean, that is a very, very serious blow to this sector of the society. And when we say we want to have an integrated society, we need to give disabled people the means to get around and have a free flow of movement. And in that sense, I think the fact that there has been such a substantial decrease in wheelchair taxis in the fleet is going to be actually compounded by this bill. And I think we have to address that, because of the age limit factor is going to absolutely make that more difficult. And I'm saying that on the basis of taxi drivers who are in that situation. The reality is that in 2009, 8% of the fleet were wheelchair accessible. Now, last year in 2012, it was less than 5%. Now we have the age limit on vehicles, which does mean taxi drivers are going to be driven off the road because of their vehicles. A lot of people find it very difficult to find the means to replace a wheelchair accessible taxi, which is hugely costly. Already they have to undertake tests, 2 tests to determine the roadworthiness of the vehicle. Now, if they've passed those tests, why shouldn't they be allowed to continue on the road? Everybody is in favour of safe vehicles, but if you have a taxi driver who adapted his taxi a number of years ago, paid heavily for that, but maintained it well, looked after it, paid for all the tests, kept it on the road, why should he or she then have to find tens of thousands of euros to replace the vehicle simply because it's come too old, when that actually may be more roadworthy than a vehicle that's of a lesser age, to be honest? And I do think that there has to be some scheme there to assist service providers in that area to replace vehicles, because if we don't have an incentive to deal with that whole area of disabled access in the taxis, then we have a problem. The problem is already there. The danger is that this bill actually exacerbates that problem, and we do need to look at that from the point of view of not just the taxi drivers who own those vehicles that are getting older, but also obviously the section of society which relies on disabled access taxis and so on. I note in the previous points to Deputy Brahan that the whole system of the penalty point system is being looked at, and I think you seem to indicate that you will be amending that. It obviously has been a huge cause for concern that people feel they may be penalised for minor transgressions and could have their licences suspended based on getting 8 points and so on, without any clarity in terms of social welfare or whatever. You've said you're going to address that, I think, in terms of appeals or whatever, but I do think, particularly in light of the recent publicity in terms of the general penalty point system and areas of discretion allegedly being applied, that there needs to be a very transparent and open system in any penalty points or punitive measure that's supposed to be there as a correction or a disciplinary mechanism. And I think this is something that will absolutely have to be addressed, because in actual fact it hasn't helped the taxi drivers. The thought of it has even made the situation worse. So look, I suppose a lot of other good points have been made. I'm not going to labour them or repeat them. Taxi drivers fulfil an important public service. They provide a vital connection in the cog of free movement of people, not least those with disabilities. They work hugely long hours to make a modest living in very difficult situations, and I do think there needs to be improvements in regulation, and probably improvements beyond what is proposed by this bill, if we are to be respectful and truly attentive to the difficult situation they find themselves in against this backdrop of austerity.